The topic of today is Rails already supports Vue components. Like Anya mentioned, I'm a senior software developer at Lexop, and I'll be talking about why we should keep using Rails in order to implement Vue components instead of resorting to other options that are considered over-engineering and reinventing the wheel. This is a very big problem in software engineering in general, is instead of people learning a library like Rails well enough to just use it correctly, they end up thinking that some features are missing because they didn't do enough effort in exploring Rails itself, and they end up writing their own library that reinvents the wheel and recreates everything that Rails already supports. And this is what this talk is against. It's basically against reinventing the wheel before you've studied Rails well enough to figure out how to do things like Vue components. So to get started, why do we need Vue components? We want to bridge the gap between visual thinking and visual programming. So if somebody gives me a mock-up of a website with a lot of elements, I can basically divide and conquer the elements and break them down into Vue components. So that means, I have a nav bar, I have a sidebar, I have a bunch of tiles here, and then I can put different things in different places. So it's a way of dividing and conquering the work or the problems, breaking problems down into smaller solutions, and then gradually delivering features. Also, we want to avoid repeating ourselves. So a very common Vue component is actually an address form. So often you would see a billing address form and a shipping address form. We don't want to repeat ourselves by writing the code twice. We want to instead create a Vue component that's an address form and then reuse it. So reuse solutions like an address form, be more productive by being able to reuse solutions instead of having to rewrite them every time. Simplify the maintainability of the look and feel of the website across the website by simply changing or updating one component. And if it's used in 20 places, it'll get updated automatically in all of those 20 places. Lastly, the third reason is to ensure consistent visual standards. So if you're working with a web designer, often they would give you sort of a style guide with a whole bunch of components that they're envisioning the website to use. And those components will ensure the consistency of the look and feel of the website. So that's about it. So let's move to the next section, which is Vue component examples. So the first example, which I already went through, is an address form. That's a very simple and common one. Another one is address view, meaning after you've entered the form and stored it into the web database, then we have an address view that will show you the address of people. You can do charting and graphing with components like a bar chart. And all you have to do is provide it with the data, and it'll draw the bar chart for you. So that way you don't have to repeat yourself every time you need a bar chart. Okay, I'm sorry, my slides are a bit wacky. That's the slide I was looking for 2 seconds ago. About visual standards, they help you comply with a style guide, like I mentioned. Also, you can automate things like accessibility, automate mobile responsiveness. So if you build a component that can support an iPhone, an Android, and an iPad, then you can reuse that component everywhere, and it'll have support for all the mobile devices automatically. Same with accessibility. If you built it to be accessible with a keyboard instead of a mouse or a voice control or stuff like that, then it'll retain that, and then you can reuse that in multiple places, including as well cross-browser compatibility. Okay, let's go back to Vue component examples. So this is a very common one, which is a sortable table. It's very often in business apps that we would want to display a table of data, and usually the columns are sortable. So that's a very common Vue component. Another one is a paginated table. So this is a table that includes pages, kind of like how you do a search on Google with a search engine, and it would give you pages at the bottom or the top. You can also implement your own paginated table component. A third kind of component, which we actually use at Lexop, is a filterable table, which is also used in many e-commerce websites. So they give you a table over here, but then you have filters on the side that let you filter the table, as well as full-text search filtering. And those solutions are combinable. Like you can build one component that supports being filterable, sortable, and paginatable. Tabs, if you want to have support for tabs, that could be a view component. You can have a progress bar as a view component that would update progress based on data that it pulls from the back end. So yeah, you would give it a URL and it would pull its data and give you progress. You can build an accordion that would hide information in those item 2 and item 3, but in item 1 it's showing us the content. So that's an accordion component. So I mean, the sky is the limit. These are just examples, and they're very few compared to how many components you can build. You can build hundreds, maybe thousands of components, of view components. So yeah, menu bars, calendar, text editor, and some components like a text editor involve a JavaScript component, a JavaScript element in it too. So you can actually build components that have JavaScript code combined with their code. A breadcrumb, a wizard, so a multi-step wizard or multi-step form lets you move from one step to the next while allowing the user to enter data. So select customer, select products, add basic data, and then confirm data. I mean, this is often used in e-commerce websites when, or even restaurant ordering websites. And you could even with games, you can implement components. So if I were to implement Klondike Solitaire as a web game, every playing card is a component. So that would be a good way of dividing the user interface into components by making every playing card a component. So how do we build view components in Rails? And that's the main topic of today. So the first thing that you can use in Rails to build view components is Rails partials. So a lot of people don't realize that Rails partials are view components. It's unfortunate that some people try to reinvent the wheel or create their own libraries to build view components in Rails, but Rails partials are already view components. So a partial is basically a partial view. So a view is, for example, if I load a page that enables me to edit the user profile, that's the view, which is the profile view. That's the full page. A partial is a part of the page. And the name is a bit technical, like Rails partial. It's a very technical name. It might not give people the impression that it's a component, but it actually is exactly what a view component is. So you can basically create, and they're usually ERB files that start with an underscore. And you can basically make an address form partial. In fact, if you use Rails scaffolding and you create an address resource or model, it'll generate for you an address form automatically, and it'll put it in its own partial. So that can get you already, half the way there, like half the way towards having an address form component. And then you can rename it, like usually they would call it underscore form and they would nest it under addresses. You can rename it as underscore address underscore form, and then to give it maybe a more explicit name, and then reuse it elsewhere in your website, not just in the address pages. But basically Rails partials are helpful in building components to present view concepts that have a lot of markup but little logic. So usually partials will not have a lot of logic. They might have an if and else statement here and there, but not a lot of if-else statements or conditionals usually, but they will have a lot of markup. By markup, I mean HTML. So I mean, here's an example of an address form. It's using basic Rails syntax for building a form, but basically it's mixing some ERB scriptlets which allow you to embed Ruby code in HTML with HTML, and that lets you build a form. But this is basically, and I mean, this is the rest of the file. but that is basically a self-contained view component that you can reuse anywhere. So if I were to rename it to something more friendly like address form, I can reuse it anywhere. Which brings me to the next point. If you're using it anywhere, what if I want to use it multiple times with different customizations? Well, it is customizable via a feature in Rails called locals, as well as instance variables, request parameters, and session variables. So anything that you have access to in views in Rails, you have access to in partials as well. So I can, locals are basically, you can pass options to a partial, kind of like in this syntax. So I'm saying render an address form, give it an address model, that's a shipping address, and give it a title of shipping address. And those options will end up becoming local variables inside the partial. So they become available in the partial syntax. So if I were to go back here to the code, you see how we're using a title at the top. So there's a title variable at the top, and that's basically coming from the locals. So basically, not only can you build view components with Rails partials, but also you can make them fully customizable with local variables or local options. Or you can, if you set any instance variables, they're going to become available in those partials. If you have request parameters, they're available in those partials. And if you have session variables, they're also available. One more thing that not many people are aware of is not only could you customize a Rails partial by passing it options like locals, like what is the title of the form and what is the address model, but also you can embed content within it if needed and customize it further. So it may accept nested content. So suppose we want to build an address form that will give users extra instructions between the title and the form over here. And those extra instructions, like a sort of a hint or a tip, could vary from page to page in your website or from an app to app. Well, that's doable. You can actually accept nested content in partials. So for example, this is how you do it. You take advantage of the feature of Ruby blocks, basically. So some people don't know this. You can use Ruby blocks in ERB files while rendering partials. So here we're rendering an address form, passing it an address and a title, but also we're opening a Ruby block and nesting content that will be, that is actually any kind of markup you want, any arbitrary markup, that will get embedded in the hint part of the address form. And within the address form code, what we do is we add a yield call. So where we want the hint to appear, which is between the title and the form, we can add a yield call, and that will yield, that will basically accept the block content that we could pass to a partial and embed it right there. So I mean, to review how that ends up looking like, yeah, this is how the form ends up looking like, because we have a title, we have a yield statement over here that will accept some content that is passed from code that is using the partial, and then here we have the form. So, I mean, this is demonstrating how partials are very, very customizable and flexible. They're not like basic, how do I say it? They're not very basic features of Rails. They're actually quite advanced and customizable. So they can address a lot of use cases. Now, I'm going to go now into a few, I'm going to go into a few, like a couple of very advanced features in partials. So usually a partial by default, by using a block, can accept one piece of content of markup that you can insert somewhere in the partial. What if you wanted to insert multiple pieces of content? That's rarely needed, but every once in a while it might get needed. You can basically repurpose a feature in Rails which is available in Rails layouts and use it from partials instead of layouts. So I'll talk about this in a moment. So suppose we have an accordion widget that has a top and a bottom, and the top can accept a piece of content, the bottom can accept another piece of content. So I can actually pass it two pieces of markup instead of one. So to do this, you would say content for accordion top. You would use the ID of that content, and then you would embed some markup, and then I can say content for bottom, and then you render the partial. If you do those two lines ahead of the partial, the dual accordion partial will then use that information. I'll show you how. It'll also use the keyword yield, but then it'll use an ID afterwards. And as long as you match the ID, you can pass it multiple pieces of markup. This is not necessarily needed all the time, but every once in a while it could solve a very good problem. And you can go beyond that. So this is the last bit of advanced features of partials. Basically, you can have an arbitrary number pieces of content embedded into a partial. So if I have an accordion with any number of sections within it, could have 3 or 5 or 17, doesn't matter. You can pass it as many pieces of content as you want that you want to embed in it. So if we go here, we have 3 of them, and we're using an index. And here you have to give the partial the item count, and then it'll figure out how you yield all of those 3 and embed them in the page. So this is the most advanced way of using Rails partials. And this is the code of the partial. Basically, it uses the item count, and then as many times as that item count, it'll execute this code, which will yield dynamically the ID of the content that'll get embedded. It can even add its own markup on top of it as well to make it an accordion. So, okay, let's go to the second method of building view components now. The next method is Rails helpers. So Rails helpers are not ERB files, they're actually methods. And they're useful for presenting view concepts with no markup usually, and a lot of logic. So unlike partials, which usually have a lot of markup and little logic, helpers are the opposite of that. They're helpful whenever you have no markup and a lot of logic. Technically, you can add markup within Rails helpers, but it's highly discouraged. Don't do it, and I'll show you why you shouldn't do it. There is a better alternative that I'm going to demonstrate in a moment. But basically, Rails helpers are useful for things like if you're pulling data from models, you can use Rails helpers as sort of like, they're basically methods that are embedded in a helper module, and those methods can act as presenters of model data. So for example, if I have a select box with a bunch of provinces in it, I can make a helper that would provide me with the provinces list. So here I can embed I can use the collection select Rails built-in helper for building a select box, but when I pull in the provinces, I'm using another helper called provinces that will give me the list of provinces. And none of that is markup. It's all pure strings, an array of strings, basically. So this is the implementation of the helper. This is a very, very basic helper where I'm just providing pure data. That's not the best way of writing the code, though. A better way would be, I'll show you how. The better way is to delegate to a model. So we would have a model called country that you can give it the name of the country, and it would give you the provinces. And that would be the best way of implementing helpers. But either way, they're basically presenters of information that doesn't have much markup in it and could have a lot of logic. And so to offload the logic from the ERB files, it's not nice to write logic in scriptlets and ERB files. You can move all of that logic to helpers. However, we can go a level beyond that. We can, you saw the select statement, the collection select statement that I showed you earlier. It's very verbal, and also on websites, there will be many times when I will need to show provinces. So what I could do is build a provinces component that will show a provinces select box, that basically encapsulates everything about the provinces select box. So that way here I can just say province select. Instead of saying collection select and passing it a whole bunch of options, I'll abstract the whole idea out behind the word province select, and I'll pass it the form, and it does everything for me. So that's a way where you can take helpers even further. Another use of helpers is basically they can be customizations of existing Rails helpers, like form helpers. So the collection select method that I showed you earlier is a Rails built-in form helper. And here we're actually building a customization on top of it that hides it and makes it only for provinces. So I mean, this is the implementation, and it hides all the details. However, we can go even further. We can customize them via method arguments. So given that helpers are just methods, you can pass them arguments like prompt true. And if I say prompt true It means it's going to add a prompt at the top of the listed provinces. And if I pass prompt false, I can remove the prompt. So here prompt is false. So I mean, let me see if the previous version had the prompt. I believe it did. Let's go back. Yeah, here it says please select. And then it shows the provinces. So you can make that the default. That could be a friendly default, but then you can customize it. So I can, in a later version here, pass it a value of, I mean, this is the implementation of it, but I can also pass it a value prompt false and it would hide the prompt. So that's another example of customizing view components. One other way of customizing helpers is actually you can combine the two. So you can combine helpers with partials, and that's the reason why it's very highly discouraged to use markup language inside helpers. Whenever you need to have HTML in a helper, delegate that to a partial. So the helper, here province field helper, can actually render a partial within it. So that way you can combine the two. So anytime you have HTML, push it to a partial. Anytime you have logic, put it in a helper. And then you can make the helper call the partial, or the other way around. That's a way of basically having both options. Like you have the best of both worlds at the same time now in Rails without needing to use a third-party library. So I can build this province field using this partial. That will hide. So for example, what I just did is I upgraded the province select box into a province field instead. A field not only shows the select box, it also shows you the label in front of it. So now this will include everything that's basically the div, as well as the label, as well as the select box. So we went a level of abstraction higher, basically. So now this automated more code. So that means I'm going to have to write less code now in the future if I need to use a province field. And that's by combining partials with helpers. So any helper could render a partial, and you can delegate any ERB code to the partial, but then do the logic in the helper. So as mentioned, that gives us the best of both worlds. You can even pass it Ruby blocks. So even helpers can receive Ruby blocks. So that way I can use the helper and then embed extra markup in it while using it inside a view. So you can go even a level even higher. So I mean, already right now, just with partials and helpers, we have so much flexibility that sadly, I wish more software engineers were aware of it, because then they wouldn't have to use third-party libraries for something that Rails already supports. However, if you need even more flexibility, the third thing that you could do is presenters. So presenters are a special form of models. So they're classes. They're just Ruby classes. That's what they are. That can hide even more logic away. So a helper gives you a method. Methods in general are not recommended to be longer than, say, 5 lines of code. You can go up to 10, 15 lines of code. But if you find yourself going above 15 lines of code, you're starting to have too much logic in the helpers. So then what you could do is actually break that logic into a class and have a full class handle all the logic with all its permutations. So you can create a presenter. So a presenter will aggregate or transform model data to present visually. So if I have an address that I want to present in a single line, you can basically, you don't want to add that logic to the address class because it's presentation logic. It's not business model logic. It will basically cloud the code of the address class, which should be more focused about the business. So what you could do is create an address presenter and have a one-line summary method on it, and that will summarize the address. So technically, you could do the same thing in a helper as well, because helper methods are also presenters. But presenters give you a level up over helpers by being able to extract classes and then reuse them in multiple views. So a helper usually, for example, I might have an addresses helper module in Rails that's focusing on address-related pages in my Rails app. Whereas if you extract a presenter could be reused from any page in your app. So it's a further generalization of the presentation concept. And and then I just use it like, so I can shorten it. So what you could do is combine presenters with helpers as well. So I can make, so here if I go back, I had to say address presenter, new, address, one-line summary. If you're using this presenter a lot, many times, I don't have to repeat myself. I can just create a helper within my addresses helper module, and I just call it presenter, and it infers the context from the fact that I'm within address pages. And if I'm there, I just say presenter, one-line summary. If I need to use multiple presenters for multiple models, then I can change the name to something else. I can call it address presenter or shipping address presenter, etc. But you can build your own abstractions with helpers that hide presenters if you want. That way the code in the view is very simple. So this is an example of how you can hide the details of presenters behind helpers. Yeah, I mean, this is an addresses helper. It has a presenter, and it prevents me from repeating this code multiple times in the view, which is a great thing. But also, so yeah, presenters are helpful also in making Rails helper logic reusable from multiple places instead of embedding it in one method. I can hide excessive logic in Rails helpers by creating presenter classes. They're usually, given that they're a full-fledged Ruby class, they're customizable either through the constructor, meaning the initialize method, or through method arguments for specific methods on the presenter, like one-line summary, that will do the work. So you can give it extra options. Like I can tell the one-line summary to, for example, exclude the name of the person and just give me the pure address without the name of the person, or stuff like that. And presenters are usable either directly from views, or from Rails partials, or from Rails helpers. So you can use it from anywhere. So that's pretty much it. So I mean, to give you a summary of the talk, why do we need view components? To bridge the gap between visual thinking and visual programming, to avoid repeating ourselves, and to ensure consistent visual standards. What are some examples? Address form, address view, bar chart, sortable table, paginated table, filterable table, tabs, progress bar, accordion, menu bar, calendar, rich text editor, breadcrumb, wizard, etc. And then how do we build view components in Rails? We use Rails partials, which are ERB files beginning with underscore, Rails helpers, which are methods, and presenters, which are classes. And with those three components, you can solve any problem with regarding view components. So any view component that you could dream up, you can build with one of those three methods or a combination of them. And that's it. That's the end of the talk. This begins the Q&A section. Go ahead.
If you can go back to one of the ERB file, you have a render method. The first argument of the render method is a string.
Okay, ERB file. Let's see. Not this one. Maybe this. No. Yes, here.
Yeah. So the first argument is a string. Is it do we have like can we take advantage of meta programming?
Yes.
Here?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Is it recommended? Or
Yeah. We actually do it. Here at Lexup, we do that. Sometimes you pass a string that is basically which partial you want to render, and then you can dynamically vary the partial that will get rendered by a helper.
Yeah. So this is common practice?
Yes.
This is common? Okay, yeah.
It's not very common. I wouldn't say that's needed all the time. I would say that's needed maybe less than 10 or 5% of the time, but it's common enough. Yeah.
Cool. Do you really recommend meta programming in application code?
Generally, no. I would avoid it until the last possible moment. Only if Only if it's automating a lot of work that would save us hours without meta programming. With meta programming versus without meta programming, then I would avoid it. I tend to not use meta programming unless really, really needed.
Yeah, because sometimes when you end up with the legacy code with lots of meta programming inside, it's just unmaintainable.
No, you need a balance between the two. Metaprogramming should not be used just because it's cool.
Yeah,
That's a big problem sometimes, where people use it because it's cool, because they can.
because
You shouldn't do
it.
just because you can. It doesn't mean it's right. It has to be right, in addition to being you being able to use it. So yeah, no, not necessarily.
I have another question. How do you test those components?
That's a very good question. So if it's a Rails partial, it's an ERB file and it doesn't have that much logic, so usually it doesn't really need a test. However, it will get tested by system tests that QA personnel write. So if there's a QA team that is writing their own automated test using Selenium, that will test all the Rails partials. But as developers, usually we don't write that much tests for them. Helpers are just pure Ruby code, so they're very, very testable. It's very simple to test them. Presenters are the same. They're even more testable. They're a class, and you could do whatever you want with it. I mean, they're not more testable. They're equally testable, I guess. So yeah, both helpers and presenters are extremely testable.
But when you want to test, especially the view component like this, you test all the page, not the component specifically. Is that what you said?
It depends. So in a component like this, I might mock this part. So I'm assuming the reason why we need a helper is there's a lot of logic. This is very simple, actually. This is so simple that we don't need a test for this.
Okay.
But if there was an if-else statement in some logic, I would add a test, but I would mock this part. I don't want to test the rendering, so I would mock it, but I would test the if-else statement and make sure that it's executing correctly based on options that are passed as arguments.
So you only test the logic, then you test all the page, like two separate tests.
The pages will get tested by the QA people that write system tests through Selenium from a browser, whereas the logic of the helpers will get tested with Ruby tests. You had a question, go ahead.
That might actually be a stupid question, because I haven't been working with Rails for a while, but you showed us
there are no stupid questions here. That's okay.
Cool, thanks. You showed us the markup part of the components. However, if we're going to ensure visual conformity to the design system, we're going to need some CSS. And
yes,
is there a way to have scope CSS?
That doesn't. So that doesn't conflict whatsoever with everything that was explained today, because basically any partial that you're using that has markup in it is skinnable skinnable with CSS, as well as customizable with JavaScript as well. So you can have partials link to their own, you don't have to link them actually. You can have CSS externally based. So basically what I would do is in this partial, I would give it a class. You would give it a CSS class, and then in my CSS files, I would customize the look of that class. That's all you have to do. So I usually will do that, and sometimes what I'll do is I'll break my CSS files down by the view components. So if I have a view component called accordion, I'll have a JavaScript file for it called accordion.js, and I'll have a CSS file called accordion.css. They will have only the CSS and JavaScript for that view component. So yeah, that doesn't conflict whatsoever with using view components the Rails way.
Yeah, that makes sense, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. You can ask me any questions after the talk, but that's about it for the talk. Mathieu Gagné seems to be absent today.
Yeah, he has a personal emergency, so he won't be able to make it today due to the storm and electricity issues.
Okay, well, I mean, that'll give us an extra half hour of networking time, so that's pretty good. So
absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, indeed. Michel, the CTO, around if you have questions about Nextcloud, architecture, and CTO stuff. We have Andy still around.
Yes, we're hiring a Lextop. We're hiring software developers that are intermediate level, right, and senior level.
Yes.
So I think, did you guys mention Mathieu?
Yes.
We said so. So we said that we will now network and people can come to you to ask you questions.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask him now too, right? You guys have any questions for